Hello everyone. So we're back here just watching the play out from my latest comp of the EMP. And I'll just talk a few things about this one here now and then jump back over to Houdini and we can start with a little recap. So overall I'm pretty happy with the way this has turned out. I know I had my reservations on the motion of the magic element, but I think it's actually doing a really good job and fulfilling its purpose there of making something interesting in the middle of the shot and in the middle of the scene between the drone and the edge of the shockwave. So it gives us something interesting to look at while we wait for the next shockwave to happen. So I think that actually works quite well. On the surface of the sphere itself, it's definitely working on the first half. So as it expands from the drone, it's very subtle, but there's definitely some noise in there and some highlights on the ground. Once it passes camera and we see it on the back wall, it could use some work. So if you're busy working on this and you want to take it a little bit further, some finesse, the back part can definitely be blurred slightly maybe, or treated in a different way where it doesn't create that hard edge, which is quite distracting. For the electrical element, I'm really happy specifically with the ones that are connected to the drone. I think they look really good. They have a really interesting shape. They move and flash, and they compositionally really hold it together. All these lines are traveling down towards the drone itself, so it keeps our eyes centered there in the middle. The electricity running along the floor, it's a little bit over the top, I think, but it does a good job of highlighting the edge of the shockwave as well. Because the shockwave passes us pretty quickly, but we're left with this lingering electrical sort of haze that travels in the same direction, and it does a good job of outlining that. We also get the benefit of the interaction there with the car in the background and this car here in the foreground. We get some electrical interaction there, which is nice. The volumetrics are very subtle, but if you're doing this comp yourself or you're working on something similar and you try and take the volumetric elements out, I think it makes a huge difference having something like that in. There's a lot of light coming from just the electrical stuff interacting with the volume itself. So I wouldn't take that out, and I think subtle is good, and it's just doing what it needs to here. Okay, and then I've just added a little grade at the end to push the whole scene slightly greener again, because I did force everything to be extremely blue, and I added a little camera shake at the end. But the transition to white didn't work so well, so I've just cut to black. So maybe I'll revisit that or just leave it. I think it kind of works like this. So let me stop this and let's jump over to the Houdini scene quickly. Right, so this is the same scene we did the decloak. So that's over here. So we just moved over to the side and we worked on the shockwave. And that all started with the proxy shockwave we made here. So basic sphere subdivided, made sure we have a rest. And then we have a simple animation, which is also positioning the shockwave into the correct location. So positioned there, and then we just keyframed the transform and time shifted it twice to make our pulses. So nothing special there. And for the actual volume fog behind this, we simply filled the sphere with points, converted it to a VDB, and applied the same animation. So we ended up with a pretty solid volume that was computationally pretty cheap, I think. And so using that, we ran through with the rest of our effects here. And if you guys are working on your own and you've seen different reference, or you just want to try some other stuff, maybe you have more layers or less layers that you think work better in the comp. So these are the ones we ended up with that I made. So some pretty simple ones here to start. We've just taken those spheres that we made and made sure they have velocity. And then I just transferred the color from the environment to the sphere with a blend, so that we ended up with a color that we could use as a mask. So that was simply shaded with a highly reflective shader, which we actually didn't end up using the reflection, funnily enough. And just outputting that color as a mask and then using it again in combination with some noise to create a little bit of detail on the surface. Jumping over to the volume, nothing special there. We just loaded in that fog and rendered it with a basic volume shader core. So very basic there. Then the electrical setup was a little bit more difficult to nail down exactly. Sort of started with just a simple particle sim where we just took particles and emitted them off of where the shockwave touched the ground. So anywhere the shockwave touched, we saved that point using an attribute transfer again and just sourced a particle from that. So we ended up with a bunch of particles that live for a little while and travel along the entire environment. After that, some basic attributes for our copy. So we ended up copying lines, simply raying them back to the ground, doing that a few times, and then applying a noise. And if you're not used to working with VOPs, I guess this noise could be a little bit daunting to look at here, because it's more than just the noise. But if you watch the video, it's not that complicated, and you just really have to think logically about what you want. So the basis is we're just taking the age of the particle and using that as a mask for the amplitude of the noise. The rest of the noise settings is just about how good you can get the shapes to look. Then we're simply outputting the color again as an alpha and multiplying the whole noise down by the curve U attribute, which is the same as the length of the line. And we duplicated the setup and basically built one that was not based on the environment, but instead pointed its second point straight back and rayed to the drone itself. So same thing, we just copied lines onto points in the environment based on when the shockwave was passing over, and then we rayed the other point on that line back to the drone itself. Added the same kind of noise system, which is pretty much the same as the other one. And then what I thought added quite an interesting difference to this effect in the comp was this color ramp. So the slight variation in color on this electricity over time gave quite a nice flashing effect. And then just a polywire for the rendered one and a different polywire, slightly thicker, for the geolight, and that just had an emissive shader on it. Dust sim, nothing special here. Just we had to assemble those spheres to get a uniform scattering of points for each sphere. So that's all we did, and then we just generated our source by combining the environment and the point cloud from that scattered points. And we ended up with, let's see if I can show it. We ended up with this point cloud, which is the points scattered on the spheres. And then the environment, again, attribute transferred from that back onto these points so that we had a color that was very close to the ground. So we just used that as a density attribute to generate our source. And this sim did actually end up taking quite a long time to sim, and you can see in the finished product it's not very dense at all. So I think we could lower the resolution. And so that became our dust. So it's super dense in the viewport, but it's not actually dense at all. I think it's got a basic pyro shader on it. And I've dropped down the max density of that volume to 0.1. So it's actually 10 times less dense than it looks here. And that's doing its job. It's mainly there as something that's moving or reacting in the environment that makes it feel like the shockwave has power. And on top of that, it's being lit by all of these extra geolights we've made. So it does work quite well. And then the magic was an effect we've done before, essentially, which is simply taking a sphere, sourcing some volumetric simulation in every direction from that sphere, then generating a nice detailed source of points with noise, and just advecting that. The only slightly special thing we did here was we generated a gradient from the density using a volume analysis, and used that as a second advection inside the popnet to force the particles to feel a little bit more stringy. Simple here, alpha from age. Used a pre-render script to get some randomization in our output from our particle sim. Brought all those particle layers together, added the time shift, so a different time for each one, and ran it through a rasterization to generate a volume with a velocity field and a temperature field so that we could use our emission in the shader. And that was the magic. So only other thing is we have a geolight from the spheres themselves. That's just automatically using the white and black colors to define where the light should be stronger. We have an electricity light generated from the polywired electricity. And then we have a volume light, which is using the final render output of the magic as a light itself and pointing to the same shader. And that's basically the effect. And we did use every single one of those passes in comp. Just a few extra environment passes here for those extra lights we made. And then each one of these, all you can do is test render them and make sure that they render in a reasonable amount of time for you. I think I had probably, maximum 6 pixel samples. Oh, I went up to 10 for the electricity. That was that motion blur electricity can be, because it's so thin, it needs more samples, but luckily it's very quick to render. So most of the others are probably about 4. The dust, I think it was the dust I struggled to render, so I rendered at a lower resolution. Pretty low pixel samples. So nothing special going on in the mantras, it's more just trying to balance both the pixel samples, the resolution, deciding what actually needs to be visible. So do you need lights? Which lights do you need? And in the limits, we're going very cheap with this project because we don't have a render farm, etc. So there's very few times where I'm relying on any secondary bounces or indirect lighting. So yeah, we went pretty cheap on that. And that's it. So that was the Houdini side, just rendered out all of those layers to 230. And then if I jump back over to the comp, so here is our decloak. And then down here, let me remove this. simply used the same emission pass from the drone as you've just seen to make our little anticipation effect there. And I think what made a big difference to this whole effect is knocking down the gain on the environment a little bit, just to make the shockwave feel like it had punch. Then we combined our geolights, added those to the scene. So nothing different here that we haven't done before. It's mainly a case of just getting all of these many elements to balance well with each other. So in terms of intensity, in terms of color, how they all fit nicely together is the trickiest part about this. Otherwise, you'll see many of the same things we've done in other effects we've done here for this comp. So we combine those together. Here I was trying another option, which was, don't know if you'll see it, these kind of streaked blurs, these vertical blurs, which is just you take this, you make it very contrasty, and then you blur in just one direction. And you end up with these kind of streaks. But I found it very distracting, so I didn't use that in the end. So, and then we ended up what is this? That's my volume. So that's my volume merged on with the magic and the arcs, and then on top of that, our little detailed sphere surface, which looks a lot more interesting when it's on black, but it's definitely doing its job here of holding everything in. A little bit of a grade to make everything intense. So not a huge amount of complicated comping on this effect. Like I said, it's more a balancing act, and our decloak was a lot more sort of all over the place to get those masks working, but this is pretty standard, just color correcting stuff, merging until they feel good together. So a real opportunity here to experiment and take this effect into different places. And here is just the extra stuff I put on, so the camera shake, my little tint in color, and that's it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the EMP effect. I look forward to seeing some different variations on this theme. If you take the time to add some extra layers or to work specifically on one type of EMP that doesn't have these layers, would be really nice to see that. And so with that, we end the entire workshop. I hope you guys have had a good time, and I hope if you're already quite experienced in Houdini, that you learned a few extra tips and tricks that you haven't seen before. And I hope if you're relatively new to Houdini and comping and effects in general, that you were able to follow well enough that you've managed to make some pretty pictures of your own. And I will see you guys in the forums or on Discord, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. So I hope you've all enjoyed every single one of these effects, and I'll see you around. Bye.